today we're going to start a new series, and we've spent the last spring looking at the book of Judges, and so today we're going to start by switching to the New Testament and looking at the Gospel of Mark. And what I'd like to do today is basically do an introduction. We won't even much look at the book of Mark today. We'll start that next week. But what I want to do is kind of go through some basic things with Mark. For example, what in the world is the Gospel of Mark? What kind of literature is this? Who wrote it? When did whoever it is that wrote it? And who was it written to? Who was the audience? And what was it that this audience may have been experiencing? What may they have been going through that that made this gospel and the way that it's presented particularly relevant to them in their situation? Okay? So, we'll start off by asking a basic question. What is the Gospel of Mark? What kind of literature is it?
Action adventure.
Oh, okay. Action adventure literature. That's actually kind of an insightful observance into how this letter, this book seems to function in the way it sort of describes the story of Jesus. And we'll talk about some of the words that he uses. One word that comes up a lot in the Gospel of Mark in Greek, it's uthos, which means suddenly or immediately or right away or and now, right? And so it almost becomes, some have said it kind of reads like a movie script, right? It's really action-packed, okay? So what is it? What else? How would you define the type of literature it is? Anybody else have an idea?
Would you say something like it's a compilation of events and stories as seen through the eyes of others?
Oh, interesting. Okay, a compilation of events and stories as seen through the eyes of others. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Anybody else?
Are they sort of a biography?
Okay. Okay, so define, when you say biography, what do you mean by biography?
Telling the story of someone's life.
Okay, telling the story of someone's life. Okay. Okay. What kind of things go into a biography? If you're going to tell the story of someone's life, what do you put in it?
Childhood events. Childhood events.
Oh, childhood events. Okay.
Maybe their purpose, what their life was about.
Okay, what their life was about, or maybe call it the things that form them to become the person that they are. Okay. Okay. So those are kind of biographical things that we often see in what we call a modern biography. Okay. What else?
It's a movie with an alternate ending.
Okay. Yeah. And in fact, there's at least two endings. It's maybe three. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay. What else is it?
It's narrative literature. It's not prophecy or poetry or that kind of thing.
Okay. Okay. It's told as narrative. That's good. That's good.
It's primarily stories, not analysis.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Primarily stories, not analysis. Okay. Is it told in the present tense? Let me ask that differently. Is it told as if it were an eyewitness, or is it told as if it were something else?
Present tense. person tense.
Okay, and by that do you mean as an eyewitness telling it, or do you mean as a third person telling it?
Eyewitness account.
Eyewitness, interesting. Okay.
I say it's a third person.
You say it's third person, you say eyewitness. Okay, we have a debate. Okay, we will cover that. So here's some interesting things. When we try to pin down the genre, which is what genre is a term that we use in literature, we also use it in film, to talk about sort of the features of a story. What are the features or characteristics of a story? So, for example, if I were to take the genre of musicals, okay, just to do something totally different. Musicals have a romantic pair, okay? There's a love interest between two pairs. They might be unlikely pairs, okay? A guy and a girl that somehow fall in love. And the story tends to follow the plot line of boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy loses girl, and then boy gets girl back, okay? Every musical written kind of follows that sort of basic plot line and structure, okay? Or plays with it in some way, okay? West Side Story, Sound of Music, Carousel, Oklahoma, Guys and Dolls. I mean, you just name them all, and that's kind of how they fit.
I thought they covered they all had music in it.
And they all have music in it, okay? But there's more to it than that, right? Is everything that has music in it a musical? Okay. So, you get into these sorts of classifications of, well, what is it not? What genre does it fall into? And so, for quite a while, scholars ask the question, well, what sort of genre is the Gospel of Mark? Or largely, what genre are the Gospels? Okay, we call them Gospels, okay? But does that mean they all fit the same sort of structure? Is Gospel a genre, or is it something else? Well, what we find is that as the way you classify this literature kind of impacts how you interpret it, how you see it functioning. Okay? Well, what this is not, is it is not a biography in the modern sense of a biography. And why is that? Well, do we know anything about Jesus' childhood? No, not a peep. Very little, right? We know and it's not until we get to Matthew that we even have a birth story. Mark doesn't even give us a birth story. It kind of picks up right smack dab at what it calls the beginning of the good news of Jesus. So, it's not really, it doesn't fit the features of a modern biography. It's certainly not an autobiography because it's not Jesus writing the story, right? So it's not a biography. And it really doesn't seem to be a historical eyewitness who is retelling events as they saw it. Okay? And I'll say more about that in a minute. You may question, whoa, hold on. But hold on to that thought because I'm going to give you an early reference that even backs that up. And it is rooted in what I will call historical traditions. Okay? It's rooted in memory about the life of Jesus, even though it is not an eyewitness account of the events. And at the same time, it is not mythology. Okay? It is rooted in something real that happened in a real individual, in real time, in real events, not trying to tell some sort of mythological story like the Odyssey. Also, we see some similarities with what was called in the Greco-Roman world BOI, okay, which are biographies. It's a way of writing ancient biographies that were much more about giving anecdotes that communicate a person's character. Okay? It has some similarities, but it even doesn't really fit that sort of a genre. It's really kind of its own thing. It doesn't fit. these categories. And by the way, the other Gospels don't really fit either. They're kind of this sort of unique thing. But they're also very different, so we can't even lump them all together and say, well, they all do this. Okay? There's differences even between them. Some of the unique features that we see in Mark is Mark gives us two pictures of Jesus. He is fully human, and he is fully divine. And he includes this literary device, which scholars call the messianic secret, which is Jesus spends a whole lot of time telling people, don't tell anybody who I am. Okay? There's a time for that revelation to be made, and Jesus is in control of it. Okay? And it's a device that we see that it builds to a point where it's finally revealed. Okay? But he spends a lot of time saying, don't tell anybody who I am. Jesus is part of called the universal history. Okay? He has a beginning, but he is also coming back to act as judge. It's a very apocalyptic view of the world. In past series, we've talked about apocalyptic worldview. We see it in Paul's writings. We'll talk more about it as we talk about Mark. And particularly Mark chapter 13 is very apocalyptic in the way that it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? And about the second coming and things like that. And Jesus not only speaks to his contemporaries that he is, his message, the way it's presented in Mark, is not just to the people within the story, okay? But the way it's presented also is meant for the original readers, the original hearers, and how it relates to their lives, right? So we can see, you don't have to scratch very deep to see, okay, yes, he's talking to the people there that are in front of him, but he's also talking to me, okay, in that original audience. Okay, so it's got sort of a dual purpose. And it is, as was said, it's narrative, and it is episodic, meaning it tells episodes from the life of Jesus. It is not anecdotal, meaning it's not telling us these things to say, well, here's an example of how Jesus was a good teacher, and then it gives a story of Jesus being a good teacher. Or, here's an example of how Jesus was a good healer, and here's a story of him being a healer. Okay? Or, Jesus debated with the Pharisees and smacked them up one side and down the other, and here's some examples of how that happened. Okay? Instead, it does those things, but it does it in an episodic way, where it's giving you just the episodes without trying to overtly tell you about Jesus' moral character, for example. Okay? Those are some of the features. We also see that the gospel itself, Jesus teaches in parables throughout the gospel, but at the same time, the gospel itself is kind of a big parable that uses the life of Jesus to tell its readers, to challenge its readers to become part of that story. It invites participation. And that participation is, what am I supposed to do? And I think, as we'll see when we get towards the end, the ending of Mark in some ways is kind of unsatisfactory. Right? The original ending. I'm not talking, it was clearly unsatisfactory to later writers because they added endings to it. Okay? And we know from the various manuscripts that we have what they added. And so it ends in a very open-ended way. And the question it seems to invite the reader into is, go back and read this story again and figure out what you're doing. How do you fit into this story? How are you being faithful to following Jesus? Is the way that it is structured. And it invites the hearer to participate in that message. The story is unfinished. You continue the story on. What else do we know about it? Who is the central character? Okay. So, who is the central character? Just like who's buried in Grant's tomb, right? Okay. It's like, is it that easy? Well, okay. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to argue the answer is no. It's not Jesus. Okay. The central character of the Gospels is God. And you say, oh, but God is Jesus. Well, that's not what I mean. God, the central character is God the Father.
So the Gospels is the genre?
All of the Gospels, yeah, if you want to say the Gospels is a genre, very loosely, the Gospels are about God. And they're about what God is doing in the world. How God has injected himself into the world and his saving act that he has done for humanity through Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not trying to diminish Jesus. I'm actually trying to elevate God. Okay? And I'm kind of doing that on purpose because we have this tendency, I think, to push Jesus up and push God down a bit, God the Father down a bit. Okay? And part of that is, as a tradition in Churches of Christ, we have a very uneasy relationship with the Trinity that goes all the way back to Stone and Campbell. When we jettison a lot of tradition, we jettison a lot of good tradition too. Okay? And as a result, we tend to be fairly anemic when it comes to our understanding of the Trinity. Okay? And what ends up happening, and I think we also borrow this from evangelicalism, is that we elevate Jesus, and we see this particularly in the songs we sing, okay? That, we start attributing a lot of things to Jesus that the Bible says belong to God the Father. Okay? And I think we ought to reshape that a little bit, and the Gospels are a good reminder that the Gospels are really about God and what God has done. And we'll see this next week as we begin to look at the opening verses of how in the world does Mark begin this Gospel? Yes, but even before he begins it, he does begin it with John the Baptist, but he begins it with something even more fundamental that is important that we look at. Okay? Anyway, and to kind of back that up, this is something that's when you read it in Greek, it's a little more obvious because it's unfamiliar, but in English it's there if we look for it. Jesus never raises himself from the dead. God raises Jesus from the dead, or Jesus was raised from the dead. Passive. Okay? And that grammatical language is very theologically important. And yet we easily miss it. Okay, we'll have more on that. The Gospels reveal who God is, and they reveal God's actions within the world through Jesus Christ. Well, who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Mark. Okay, now everybody's gun shy. If the answer wasn't Jesus in the first one, oh, okay, you're learning. Okay, so let's say it's Mark. Well, which Mark? Mark is the most common name in the entire Roman Empire. Which Mark?
That Mark. John Mark.
Ah, okay. John Mark is who is often attributed to this. And what makes John Mark particularly interesting as an author? Why would he be a good author for a gospel?
Was he one of the apostles?
Nope. He's not one of the apostles. Good answer, good
He was
question.
a contemporary of the apostles, and he was directly aligned with Paul.
Okay, so he shows up in
Peter.
Acts, I think is one of Paul's companions, and then he's later associated with Peter, okay, in Rome. And so there's this idea, this tradition, that John Mark wrote down Peter's recollections, okay, and that's what we have in the Gospel of Mark. Okay. So let's consider that. First of all, the gospel itself makes no claim of authorship. None. It doesn't say, your Bibles might say the gospel according to Mark, but that's not part of the text. That is something your Bibles put at the top. In fact, none of the Gospels make any direct claim of authorship. Okay? The Gospel of Luke starts with, I have said it. It talks about first person, but he never says, I, Luke, set out to do these things. He just says, I set out to do these things, most excellent Theophilus. You know.
But you sort of, but in the book of Acts, you sort of think it's Luke when he's...
So what we do is we make assumptions from what's in the text in some cases, which we do in the case of Luke and Acts, where all of a sudden in the book of Acts it shifts from third person to first person, first person plural. We did this. There's even a debate within scholarship about whether that's a literary, an actual eyewitness sort of a thing. Okay. We're not going to get into that because we're doing Mark. Okay? But more often what happens is we rely on much later traditions that tell us something about authorship. Okay? And we might talk about why that's the case. So, we know from the way the book is written that what I'd like to do is rely mostly on data that we have from within the book itself. That this is not someone who was an eyewitness to the events. Now you may say, just a second, Jim, you may say, whoa, hold on a minute, what do I mean by that? Well, here's a quote. This is attributed to Papias, who is the bishop of Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, just literally across the valley from Laodicea and just down the road from Colossae. And he was the bishop from 60 to 130 AD, or CE. And he wrote, he's talking in the longer passage, the author, had neither heard the Lord nor had he followed him. In other words, this is a second-hand account. Okay? And that's cited by Eusebius in his history of the church. And it also doesn't seem that he received information directly from eyewitnesses, which also Eusebius and others seem to affirm, but that that the authorship attributed to John Mark comes about because they're trying to establish that this gospel reflects or represents or adheres to the apostolic tradition that was handed down. So in other words, when the early church is talking about who wrote what books, their primary interest is not necessarily in exactly who it was that wrote the book, but to say this book is connected to what traditions have already been passed down to us. We know what's been passed down to us. Do these writings reflect what has been passed down to us? Do they match? Okay? And so that seems to be the case of what's happening really in all the Gospels. But particularly with Mark, it gets attributed to John Mark because John Mark is associated with Paul and Peter, who, by the way, were sort of two strands of Christianity that didn't always seem to see things eye to eye, as we saw in Galatians and as we see in Acts. There's a little bit of debate that goes on there that later the church has to reconcile, and John Mark is a good way to reconcile that. Okay? I'm not saying anything about the authority of the book. The book's authoritative. The church says this is inspired. The church kept it. But they weren't so much concerned with who wrote it as they were with establishing its apostolic credentials, if that makes sense. Jim, you had a question or comment?
There's a story, when Jesus was arrested there at the night, the young man that came out in a linen cloak, they grabbed his cloak and he ran away naked, and then later the young man at the tomb. So some of the early apostolic people thought that was Mark who wrote the book. Others thought it may have been John or James or someone else.
Yes.
So in that case, if that was true, he'd been an eyewitness. And some of you thought that they had the Last Supper in the room that was Mark's mom's house. So
Yeah, so, but again, none of that is reflected in the text.
None of that in the
It's
text.
all tradition and supposition that they're using to try to glean, well, how do we add authority? Tradition, authority of this text is really their main goal, okay? Anyway, so the short answer is, we have no clue who wrote it, okay? Tradition says it's John Mark. Maybe it is. But there's nothing in the story itself that indicates that it is John Mark. It's all assumptions. They come from later tradition. So, what can we tell about this author if we can't really say who he is? Well, he doesn't seem to have access to the other Gospels. Okay? Although it is pretty clear that Matthew and Luke have access to Mark. They copy passages verbatim, and sometimes they correct Mark's grammar.
Was Mark written before the other Gospels?
Aha, okay, that's the next question. Okay, we'll get to that in just a sec. Mark's author seems to base his gospel on living Christian tradition that circulated within his church community, and it is likely that was likely included traditions of material that was passed around from church to church. Okay, so he's not making this stuff up. He's basing it on traditions that he has received, and that the author uses the common Greek. Okay, it's not polished. It contains grammatical errors at times. He switches verb tenses in the middle of phrases. He has a very limited vocabulary in terms of the words that he uses. This is not Paul. Okay, this is not Luke for sure. Okay, it's a more rudimentary kind of common person Greek. Okay, he probably also spoke some Aramaic. Okay, or maybe some Hebrew. And we know that, and we'll talk about his audience in a minute, but there are places where he explains what Aramaic terms mean. He'll put Aramaic terms into the mouth of Jesus, and then he has to explain what it means. It is, despite the very rudimentary Greek that is used, it is beautifully written, and it is highly structured. Okay? It's a well-structured, well-crafted book, even though the language that he uses is not the most elegant of languages. Maybe a good analogy is Mark Twain. Okay, you read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, and it writes in very colloquial sorts of ways, but the literature itself is just brilliant literature. Same kind of thing with Mark. And he relies on the Greek Old Testament. Okay, what the passages he quotes and the way he quotes them seem to mostly come from the Greek Old Testament, not the Hebrew. And when was it written? Well, we have some markers we can use to place boundaries on when it was written. We know that he bases it on tradition, so these traditions have had to have time to develop. So if Jesus is crucified in roughly 30 to 33 AD, then we have to see these traditions begin to develop before this gospel is written. So that kind of puts an early boundary for us. The other boundary is Luke and Matthew have to know about it. It has to have been around long enough for Luke and Matthew to get copies. So that puts it another boundary sometime in the early first century, early second century, late first century, because that's when generally we think Matthew and Luke were written. And so we've got this period of time, and then we have this interesting data point in Mark 13 where he seems to talk about the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And the question is whether he's talking about that from the perspective of the recent past, or he's speaking about it in something that's about to happen very soon. Okay? So, Jesus is crucified in 33 AD. Matthew and Luke are written, let's say, late 1st century, early 2nd century. Temple's destroyed in 70. So the question becomes, where does it fit? And most scholars today think that it's probably written between 65 and 75. And the question of where you place it on either side of 70 is based on whether or not you think that Mark 13 is told as a comment on things that have just happened or on things that are about to happen. Okay. So,
Why is it a fact that Luke and Matthew copied Mark instead of Mark copying Luke?
Good question. Good question. There are several. There actually are some scholars, a minority of scholars, that don't agree that Luke and Matthew copy Mark, but they're in a minority. What you see when you look at Matthew and Luke is that there are places where Mark, his grammar's not that great, and it gets corrected. Okay? Yet you'll have a whole passage that is literally verbatim, like copy, exactly what's in Mark, word for word, until you get to the grammatical issue, and they correct it. Okay? Or they take what's in Mark and they add a commentary to it to clarify something that perhaps was not clear in Mark. So the principle, this is what we call text criticism. One of the principles of text criticism is that in general, when you have two texts that appear almost identical, the one that is the more problematic or the more difficult is probably the earlier one. Because it's very unlikely that someone would take a pristine text that they're copying and make it worse. It's much more likely they'd take a text that had some question about it or question in it, and when they're copying it, they correct the error to make it clearer. So that's a lot of why we think. And so, and it's also things like that, like, okay, it's the word for word copying. It's the, for example, if Jesus is speaking in Aramaic and all the Gospels are writing in Greek, okay, the way they record Jesus' speeches in certain places are literally the same identical Greek. Okay, which, if anybody that speaks a foreign language knows, if you take two people that speak a foreign language, and have them translate it, the chances of them translating it word for word exactly the same into that foreign language are practically zero, right? It just doesn't, there's too many ways to say things because languages don't match up one-to-one. So, that's in a nutshell why they think it was copied. Which makes it the first gospel written. And in a lot of ways that makes sense because the way it tells the story is kind of unique compared to the other Gospels. It leaves out things that the other Gospels seem to want to address. Like, well, what happened after the resurrection? Well, what happened in Jesus' earlier life? How was he born? Mark has no interest in how Jesus was born. He starts with John the Baptist. He starts with the beginning of the ministry. So, but let me say that it may be the first of the Gospels written. It is definitely not the first of the New Testament books written. Okay? The Gospels tend to come near the end. By the time this Gospel gets written, Paul's dead. Okay? Peter's dead. So all of their writings come first. And then we get the Gospels. Okay? So they seem to also be written to a generation after that first generation of Christians as a way of preserving the traditions in a way that follows authority. Okay? So, who's the audience? Final thing. We know they were Greek speaking because the gospel's written in Greek. They seem to have limited familiarity with Jewish traditions because Mark explains some Jewish traditions. So it seems they're mostly Gentiles, but there are probably some Jews mixed in with them because the gospel deals with some things that are of concern to Jews, okay, like purity and like fasting and things of that nature. So it seems that it's probably a group that is on the edge of Judaism. They consider the Jewish scriptures to be authoritative, but they do not consider any authority or the Jewish elders or scribes. They reject their authority, but they consider their scriptures to be authoritative. They seem to be from an agrarian or lower socioeconomic background. Whenever he uses terms of money, it's always small denominations of money that get talked about. The stories are very much agrarian sorts of stories. They seem to be a group that was directly impacted by the Jewish revolt between 66 and 73 AD in Judea. And they also be familiar with the charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit. And they also seem to be a community in distress. And the question then is, where within this empire are they located? And the truth is, you could take those conditions and basically describe anywhere. Early tradition places it in Rome, because John Mark. That's where Peter and Paul died. They place it with John Mark. John Mark they place in Rome, so they put it in Rome. There's nothing in the text that indicates that this is in Rome. Modern scholarship seems to think that it's placed more on Antioch, Galilee, Syria, this sort of area over here. The truth is, we can't pin it down. We do know it gets spread around pretty good, around the Christian communities. But most would say today it's probably in Antioch, Syria, or in the Galilee, over here on the right. And if we think about the events that surround this gospel, there's some things that are pretty important that impact this area. In 60 CE, we get a strong earthquake that destroys lots of areas. In 62, the Roman army is defeated on its eastern front by the Parthians. Major military defeat. 63, they get slammed with another major earthquake. In 64, a massive fire virtually destroys the inner city of Rome. And they blame the Christians for it. And it's during that purge, that persecution, that Paul and Peter are both executed. 68, Emperor Nero, that presided over the burning of Rome, commits suicide. And in the wake of his suicide, within the course of a year, Rome has 3 different emperors. And on top of all that, during this same time, the Jews in Judea and Palestine have revolted. And so a big chunk of the army is in Judea trying to squelch that rebellion. And in the midst of that, in 70 CE, Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. There's a lot going on during this period of time. It's tumultuous not just for the Roman Empire, it's tumultuous for Judaism and Christianity. That early form of Christianity that really is still part of Judaism. And this early group of readers have been directly impacted by these events. And what the Gospel of Mark gives them is a message of hope and perseverance in the midst of social turmoil, economic turmoil, and religious turmoil. And the message is hold fast. Because this story continues through. So, Mark's the first one written, first of the Gospels, which makes it interesting to consider what's included, what's not included. We have no idea who the author is. Tradition says it's John Mark. It was probably written between 65 and 75. And you can argue either way as to whether it's before or after the destruction of Jerusalem. Probably written to the communities in Antioch, Syria, or the Galilee. But certainly was pretty widespread around the churches in a fairly short period of time. It's a community that has experienced distress, and it presents the good news as an extended parable that invites them to join into the story. And the main character is God. So, next week, here's what I'd like you to do. I did this earlier this week. I did it Saturday. I had to drive to Friday. I had to drive to Austin to deliver something to our son. And I listened to the whole gospel in one sitting. On Audible, Audible Bible, which are free. If you have that, get a free Audible or a free, audio book of the Bible. It takes 1 hour and 22 minutes. I'd encourage you to listen to the whole thing in one sitting if you can. It hits different. If you can't do that, try to read it in one sitting. It's 15 chapters long, 16 chapters long. It's not very long. Won't take you very long. But try doing that at least once to get a sense of how you hear it. It really hits different as I listened to it. Different things jumped out at me. Also, if you can, read Isaiah chapter 40 all the way to chapter 41, verse 20. And I'd like you to think, what is this passage about? Because what's going to happen is Mark's going to begin with a quote from Isaiah, from this, and I'd like you to think about why in the world does he pick this quote? Is there another quote he could have picked that maybe would be a more logical quote than the one he picks? But he picks this one. And how does that passage function in the larger context of that part of Isaiah? So read that part of Isaiah. We'll talk about that next week. And also think about where does this gospel begin? And what's missing? And maybe why? All right, I know this has been a lot of just me at you this week. Next week we'll dive more into the text and pick it up from there. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.